Welcome to Stories of Safety. In this podcast series, we will talk to the people who have shaped healthcare safety. We will explore the stories, science and policy that have shaped how we think about, manage and measure the safety of healthcare. This series is funded by the National Institute for Healthcare Research and brought to you by the Patient Safety Research Collaboration in Yorkshire and Humber. I'm Jane O'Hara. I've been a patient safety researcher for over 15 years. In this time, I've come to understand how complex healthcare is and how difficult it can be to answer one seemingly simple question. How safe are we, and how can we improve? In this series, we will be exploring this deceptively simple question from all angles, with people who have helped shape healthcare safety in the UK and across the world.
It is my great pleasure to introduce our very first guest in this podcast series, our inaugural podcastee, Shaun Lintern. Say hello, Shaun.
Hi, Jane. Hello, everybody.
So, Shaun is a multi-award-winning senior investigative journalist with more than a decade of specialist reporting on the NHS, patient care, healthcare science and politics. Across his career, he has developed a reputation for breaking investigative, high-impact, human interest stories which have changed policy and led to multiple independent inquiries. He is currently health editor at the Sunday Times and continues to bring important patient safety stories into the public consciousness, some of which we will hopefully discuss today. So to start then, Shaun, you're from Stoke. Tell me something interesting about Stoke.
Well, so it's the birthplace of the captain of the Titanic, which lots of people don't always know. And also, for those listening who haven't ever tried one, if they find themselves in Stoke-on-Trent, they should seek out the Staffordshire oatcake, which is a delicacy of North Staffordshire. And I would highly recommend it. It's not a biscuit, which anyone listening from Scotland might think. That's not an oatcake in Staffordshire is a bit more like a pancake, but made obviously from oats, a bit more savoury. You have it with bacon, eggs, sausage. It's delightful. And highly recommended. So that's the best export from Stoke I can offer anybody.
So get to Stoke and Staffordshire for full English then?
Full English in an oatcake. It's like a pancake, so you roll it up like that. And I might be wrong in this, and I'm sure someone will write in and tell us, but I think it comes from Stoke was a very industrial city, very based in mining. And I think oatcakes developed as a simple way for miners to take food, roll it up, wrap it up, and take it down the mine. That may be a myth that I was told as a child and I kept it, but that's what I've always been led to believe. It's a bit they're very nice,
like a Cornish pasty, then, because that's what I remember.
Yeah, but it's soft and floppy like a pancake. Yeah.
Well, it sounds delicious, and I'm sure there will be many people from potentially around the world flocking to Stoke to try it following this. Okay, so. You know you're from Stoke, but how did you first get into journalism then?
Well, I always wanted to be a journalist for years, really. In fact, I think it was always the career option for me. Why? I'm not really sure. I think we've joked sometimes with my parents that I used to watch, Superman movies and was fascinated by Clark Kent as a journalist. But my mum was also a journalist for local newspapers in Stoke years ago. She never went beyond that because she had two children who kept pressing the keys on her typewriter. But so she decided to give that up. But maybe it's in the blood, perhaps. But yeah, so I always wanted to be a journalist, and I got involved initially through some youth work in Stoke-on-Trent. I did the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme, and then that led me into sort of youth groups and youth clubs work, and we ended up starting a youth newspaper in Stoke-on-Trent. And we actually, I think back now in the time of austerity and public finances being what they are now, it's kind of amazing to think, but we were able to persuade, as a group of teenagers, we persuaded Stoke City Council to give us £95,000 for the first year, and we actually produced a properly printed tabloid newspaper. I was the editor, and I negotiated the print contract with a local newspaper, the Leek Post and Times in North Staffordshire. And over a couple of years, they got to regularly see this newspaper coming in, and they got to know me, and they found out that I wanted to be a journalist and was about to leave college and go off traveling. And they actually offered me the chance to work for them for a year. before I went off travelling and then came back to university. That was my first job. So I worked full time on a terrible salary for a small weekly newspaper in South Cheshire in Congleton. That's how I started out. And then I went off backpacking, came back, and was about to do English at Manchester Metropolitan University when the newspaper got back in touch with me and said, basically, you did such a good job last year. Do you want to come back and do a proper job now? We'll double your salary. We'll pay you a real salary. We'll train you as a journalist because to be a journalist, you have to do some professional qualifications post graduation, and they were offering to train me to do that straight away. And so I had to make a choice between university and all my dream job as a journalist. And I opted to leave university, and the rest is history.
Well, it sounds like you were destined for big things from the start then.
I don't know about that, but I actually loved working for those local newspapers. So the Leek Post and Times was the next paper I worked for. And for anyone who knows Leek, it's a rural market town that they'll know is very friendly and has its own sort of little universe in North Staffordshire. It's very different to Stoke, even though it's just up the road. But the farming community there is great, and the Peak District National Park, and there was some really great communities there, and covering that as a journalist was fantastic. But it was also a small market town that had lots of problems, and at times it was almost like a bit of a midsummer murders type place. There was lots and lots of murders and fatal road crashes and big fires, and so I sort of cut my teeth working there, and had to learn how to talk to people after tragic events and covering public institutions like the NHS locally. I remember the big scandal about the closure of the Leek Community Hospital and things like that. So, and all of that stays with you. You basically learn the training on the job of how to get stories, how to persuade people to talk to you. But I have great memories of working on local newspapers. I think they're a real institution, and it's a shame that we've lost so many of them across England. Actually, I really worry about the state of our democracy, because I remember I used to go to the parish council meetings for the Leek Post and Times, and we'd be sat, if anyone ever remembers the Vicar of Dibley comedy show and their parish council meetings, I sat in meetings very much like that. But people were talking about planning applications and things that were really affecting local people. I was the only person there that wasn't actually involved in this. We didn't have a vested interest one way or the other. And similarly, if you think about the bigger councils, the district councils, where millions of pounds was being spent sometimes on projects, and actually I was the only person in the public gallery watching that. So I do believe that local newspapers and local journalists, they are the frontline guardians of our democracy, keeping an eye on things. And sadly, we've lost so many of them now, that we've lost so many newspapers, and I do worry about who's doing that job now in a way that journalists do it, particularly their skill set is unique in the sense that we don't have any vested interest, we aren't biased, and we don't answer to anybody else. And I worry that in future, the jobs that I used to do and the work that I used to do isn't available now, that people can't do that now, that trainee journalists couldn't find those kinds of newspapers to work for, because so many of them have closed. But yeah, very great fond memories of my time on local newspapers.
Fun memories, but what you've described there, I think is really important, that you sort of cut your teeth and almost had a really formative apprenticeship, didn't you, in some of the skills of understanding people's experiences within the context of their communities and why things are so important to them and how it shapes their lives. So did you know anything about healthcare or patient safety when you started working as a journalist?
No, not at all. So I remember saying to a colleague of mine, actually, that where we were discussing what sort of specialisms we might go into later in our careers. And I remember saying, I definitely don't want to do health. I want to do something sexy like politics or crime. And, looking back now, sitting here as the health editor of the Sunday Times, I've discovered there's an awful lot of crime and an awful lot of politics in health. And actually, I love the patch now. So as I'm sure we'll get on to, I describe myself as an accidental health journalist. And I knew nothing about health before I got involved in it. And yes, when I first covered the NHS in Leek. I remember it was about the community hospital and the concerns that the community had that was going to be closed down. And, it's kind of amusing when I go back over those stories and think how green and naive I was about some of those things, because little did I realise that story was playing out in the context of a national system with all sorts of problems and complexities that I was kind of blind to, because I was just a reporter on a little local paper in a little local town.
So, I mean, you've described yourself as an accidental health journalist there. I like to think of myself as a bit of an accidental patient safety researcher. So you're in good company there, I think.
Really, we all are in this field.
And it probably makes it interesting as well.
I think if you talk to a lot of people in patient safety, that was never their intended target. They end up there because either of their own experiences or experiences of people they know, and they just get captivated by there's something about patient safety that is a captivating subject. And it matters to all of us, doesn't it? Because we can all end up as patients, and we can all end up, we all touch wood and hope that we don't, but we all end up in those situations where something might go wrong. So I can understand why it's fascinating and why everybody working in patient safety is here by accident. Once it's got you, it's got a nice light grip. So, people say to me, "Oh, what's next for you? Where are you going to go next?" And I always think, well, for me, I will continue to write about health and patient safety and until I get bored, really. And I've yet to get bored. I think I'll be very happy if I get to the end of my career and I'm still the health editor of the Sunday Times. That would be perfectly fine by me.
We're going to come back. I've got some questions later. Come back, I think, to some of the issues around journalism and healthcare later. So keep that at the back of your mind. So you famously broke the story about poor care and excess deaths at the Mid Staffordshire NHS Trust, which so the poor care was judged to be between January 2005 and March 2009. And then this was investigated by Sir Robert Francis, who published his findings along with 290 recommendations in February 2013. So for the uninitiated, for those listening who might not be aware, what can you remember about the main issues that came up in the Francis report, the main issues for the mid-staff scandal, if you like?
Yeah, I mean, to distill it right down into a sort of few short sentences, I think, we had a small, isolated district general hospital at a time when the NHS was under huge pressure financially to save a lot of money. It was in the Patricia Hewitt time when the NHS needed to save £1 billion in 1 year. And I mean, in the context of today's situation, it's kind of laughably small. But then it was a huge pressure on that small hospital, an inexperienced board, and they made some choices that ended up sending them down a certain track. So to save a lot of, I think they had to save £10 million. They axed an awful lot of nurses, something like 150 nurses lost their jobs, which, when I'm just saying that now, that sounds madness. In today's context, we just wouldn't do it. And that's one of the lasting legacies of mid-staffs, that sort of decision probably wouldn't happen today. But those decisions to cut those nurses, it ended up in a situation where staff were being stretched, the hospital didn't have the resources, and a culture developed of a toleration of poor care and a sort of circling of the drain. And it got worse and worse and worse, to the point where you ended up with, registered professionals delivering quite cruel care to patients, managers not listening when the good staff tried to raise concerns. And so everything just kept getting worse. And some of the stories that came out from mid-staffs, the level of poor care that people received, was truly blood chilling. Just to think that this happened to vulnerable people, grandparents, mothers and fathers. And I interviewed a lot of the families who were affected, and their stories really are heart-wrenching. And that an NHS did this to their loved ones, caused such a lot of anger. And at the time, when it first sort of began, all we really felt was that this was a hospital delivering poor care. We initially realised it, myself and the families and other journalists working on this, don't think we realised at that point actually what a systemic situation we were seeing play out at mid-staffs. It was like all of the risks in the NHS had condensed down in that one district general hospital. So that, this wasn't a scandal that just affected their maternity ward or their A&E department. There was poor care across many of the wards in that hospital. The surgery department was described as frankly dangerous and needed to be shut down. The A&E department was described in the inquiry by a consultant as being immune to the sound of pain and delivering cruelty. There was a lot of poor care on the general medical wards. There was maternity issues. It was really across the board, across the hospital. And that, I think, is why Mid Staffs is still, even now, 10, 15 years on, still quite a totemic scandal, because it really did shock everybody about the scale of that in that one hospital.
So you've described this situation where, you went in with, some concerns, but it became something much bigger. How did you come to first learn that there were problems at the hospital?
So it's one of those classic stories of just sort of being in the right place at the right time. So I was working then for the Express and Star evening regional newspaper in sort of in the Wolverhampton, South Staffordshire area, so around Stafford. And I was in the office one night, and a colleague of mine was on the phone, and I heard him say something to the effect of, old people die in hospital, that's not a story for us. And he kind of put the phone down. And the Express and Star was a big newspaper with its pages, had lots and lots of stories on them, squeezed in, in a way, very old-fashioned, actually. But one of the problems was, as a journalist, you had to fill those spaces. And sometimes they were quite small. And I had allotted a sort of credit card size story space that needed to be filled. And I overheard this conversation, and I said to my colleague, can I get that number? I'll give them a call back. Maybe I'll just get a little something from them for this little slot. And I spoke to Julie Bailey, who was the daughter of Bella Bailey, and who Julie went on to found the Cure the NHS group. And I rang her up and I just said, can we start again? And she gave me this, she told me about what had happened to her mother. We wrote this short story, and that was the first story I wrote. She had stories in some of the other local papers as well. I certainly wasn't the only journalist to write about Stafford Hospital. I think I just stuck with it for so long and sort of worked with the families to expose things. But what happened from that small article, we got more people contacting us. And I remember at one stage when the group actually sort of initially formed, they had a sort of public meeting I think it was in a pub actually. But the first time I sort of felt this is strange, there's something different here, was when they had this public meeting, and instead of it being a handful of people, which is what you would normally get for something like that, there was dozens of people turning up to talk about the hospital and what was going on. And we were getting just regular people contacting the newspaper. Each story we'd run would get more and more people coming forward saying, well, that happened to me and that happened to my mom. And staff at the hospital would come forward very, very reluctantly. And interestingly, because of the culture in that hospital, I think a lot of staff were very defensive, actually. So I used to get threatening calls late at night in the office as well from people who were associated with the hospital. It was a very divisive issue, actually. Stafford is a county town, and the hospital was one of the biggest employers in the town. And ultimately, towards the end of the sort of scandal, when the public inquiry was raging and there was concerns the A&E was going to be shut down, it got very toxic, actually. There were it became very political, and people on both sides took a view, and it got quite nasty at times. But that's years later. I mean, I was sort of stuck with this story for over a sort of 4 or 5 year period from 2007 to 2009, which is when the scandal really erupted nationally, and the government had to take the investigations and inquiries. But it was an interesting few years.
I mean, there's so much to unpick there. It's an incredible story, and not least, I think, just sitting here as a patient safety researcher, I'm just thinking, the things that are common about your experience and people, I suppose, who are thinking about, how do you make sense of data? How do you understand what's going on in your service? And I think what you're describing is that it just takes a lot of work. You have to join the dots. You have to seek out different sources of information and hear from different people. And I think, what you're describing is that's a real skill, isn't it? And actually you have to devote time and energy to trying to sort of join that web of information together.
Well, one of the things that people need to remember about Mid Staffs is that this was a scandal that played out actually almost in full view, because we had systems of regulation, we had data on death rates, mortality rates, compensation claims. There was information there, and as we know from the public inquiry, public bodies, they either thought somebody else was doing that bit of the work, or they thought that they took the assurance they were given from the trust and didn't probe any further. There were plenty of warning signs about mid-staffs that were missed and not acted on. And for me, what mid-staffs kind of crystallized was the importance of listening to patient voices. They're the ones who tell us what's really happening in their experiences. And mid-staffs was a classic case where the NHS forgot who it was there for and stopped listening to the patients and the families. And eventually, they made themselves heard with some help from the media as well. That's one of the things that raised big questions for the system, Mid-Staffs, as to why did all these bodies fail to spot this? Why did all these regulators and all these smart people who were there to do a decent job, no one wants to cover up poor care, but they actually ended up doing that for their own systemic reasons. And that's what Robert Francis found, was that the culture that I started writing about Mid-Staffs, thinking this is a hospital delivering poor care, actually that culture and that defensiveness and not willing to tackle things actually spread not just from the hospital, but that's the culture that we ended up with, and that's Mid-Staffs was the effect.
So I think you're right to point out there that actually people were looking at the system. They were just potentially looking in the wrong place and for the wrong things. And I suppose as somebody interested in how we understand how safe services are, I often think it's about what lens you're using and where you're pointing that lens. And so in this circumstance, they were almost pointing the wrong lens in the wrong direction, really. Monitor were looking at finance, and people were much more concerned about, as you say, efficiency savings and meeting those targets, and thinking that they were probably doing a good job, actually.
Yeah.
And all the while, they were not really hearing from or even seeking to hear from the people that was potentially affecting.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there wasn't the focus on safety and quality of care, regulatory sense, like there is today. The CQC is the sort of, and the CQC is the Care Quality Commission's got all of its problems now. It's not perfect, but it's a far better organisation now than it was back then. And in fact, it didn't even exist for many of the years that Mid-Staffs was harming patients. But the other thing I just have to say, Jane, is that I missed Mid-Staffs as well. Well, not me because I wasn't there, but the newspaper missed Mid-Staffs as well, because I was asked to give evidence to the inquiry. And as part of that, I had to go through all of the stories that were written about the hospital over the sort of 5-year period that the inquiry was looking at. And it was amazing to me that the first story, which was back, I think, maybe in 2005, might have been January 2005 was the timescale. The very first story was warning about fears over the risks of cutting nurses and quality of care. And so the newspaper was covering all these stories, but we as an organisation didn't connect the dots ourselves until much later, until we were sort of made to by the patients. But there was also evidence of this out much earlier than all of this. And this is still, I think it's still available on Google if people wanted to go and check. But there was a speech given at the Royal College of Nursing's annual congress in 1999, where the General Secretary there talked about the risks of poor care for patients and the importance of nurses. And she actually cited a hospital which was cutting the number of nurses, and she feared it would have problems for quality of care. And which hospital was she referencing on a national stage? Stafford Hospital. And that was in 1999. 10 years before the scandal blew up. So there was lots of signs there that people could have acted on, could have raised questions about, and we just didn't. And I think it took a group of bereaved, harmed patients to make the system sit up and listen. And, they are an incredible group of people, and I remain friends with them to this day. But they should never have had to have that job and that responsibility. But that if it wasn't for them, I don't think we would have ever uncovered it.
So I want to take you back to the sort of the first big publication of the story, if you like, from your perspective. So I imagine that bringing together the story, that must have taken a lot of time. How long was it between first learning about concerns for you at the Trust and to publishing a composite piece about the concerns?
Well, it's interesting that we didn't actually sort of do a expose piece. What sort of happened was it was sort of death by 1,000 cuts, as awful as that is to say. But so, and actually, it was a very powerful way of doing it, and it's a technique I've actually used again in other stories that we might talk about. So we did the initial little credit card size story that I've mentioned with Julie Bailey, and then other families would come forward and we would do stories on their cases. And I sort of developed my own kind of process, really, of for us to write the story. It obviously had to be a good story, which means it had to be a bad experience, but it also had to be fair to the hospital. So anyone who came to us with wanting a story about this, they had to show us that they'd made an official complaint in the past before coming to us. We had to have evidence. We had to see copies of reports or letters or complaints so that we could establish that this was a thing they were doing long before I'd started writing about it. We had a process to verify the patient's stories. And so we would do each one of these sort of individual stories until eventually it kind of hit a critical mass. And I think that would have been around the 2008, middle of 2008 time, when there was a combination of patient stories and patient complaining through the media, and also concern about mortality rates being picked up nationally that were sort of sending red signals. And these two things were combined, and the patient families found out about the mortality rates, and that was raised as an issue. And then the Healthcare Commission, which was the forerunner to the CQC, as is now, they announced an investigation. And that was I think, the starting gun for, oh, this could be big, this could be something significant. It's very rare for them to do an investigation. And that kind of opened the floodgates then, because lots of people felt almost enabled then to say something, to talk about what had happened to them, because there was a proper regulatory process going on. And that took about a year. And when the report came out, it was dreadful. It was really bad about the sort of standards of care and what was known at the time. But all the time over this 12 months, we'd been publishing more and more case studies, and we were putting that in the public domain on the front page. It was hard for people to read. And so by 2009, it really blew up. And that's when ministers started to face the pressure and face questions in the House of Commons. You know, that there had to be a proper official response to the Healthcare Commission's investigation. And things then sort of snowballed out of control. And that's when the families threatened the Labour government with a judicial review if they didn't call an inquiry into the scandal. And that's when, I think it was Andy Burnham at the time, as Health Secretary, I think reluctantly, he has tried to say that he did this sort of off his own back, but I know that he did it because he was also getting legal letters from the families. He commissioned Robert Francis to do the first sort of initial inquiry, which was not the public inquiry. But then the general election came in between, and the Tories said that there would be a public inquiry. And so that followed. We thought we knew a lot before the inquiries, but actually we learned just how bad it was. It was even worse than we could have imagined when the inquiries actually published their findings, and that's when it became a sort of a major scandal.
So at the core of the scandal are these experiences of patients and their families, and as you say, they make quite difficult reading, and having met some of the families and worked with them since, I know how difficult that must have been. But I also imagine that sharing that experience with you as a journalist might have made them feel quite vulnerable. So how did you work with people and convince them to trust you to tell their truths to you?
It's a really difficult job, actually. So we have a thing in journalism, which it sounds as awful as it is, called the death knock. And that's when journalists go out and knock on the door of people who have lost someone. Often it can be after a murder or a road traffic accident or a hospital death. And I remember my first death knock and remember, my knees were shaking and I was trembling because it's an awful thing to do. You are intruding into someone's grief. And what I will say, though, is that a lot of people respond very well. They want to talk about their loved ones. They want to share that story. And I think there is a way to approach it, you have to approach it. And I always try to approach it as a human being. So I always began by saying to them, I'm really sorry that I'm here and that I'm doing this. I've been asked to do this. If you want me to go, I will never bother you again. But I think you might have something worth saying that other people need to hear. It could have a bigger impact beyond you and us. And it's maybe you want to think about that. And I always try to approach those conversations initially by saying, I'm happy just to have a conversation that's not for reporting. And I'll tell you a little bit about, what I am as a journalist, how that works, what the process is. And really, it's kind of just to earn people's trust. I mean, in a way, I'm being very manipulative. As a journalist, I'm out for a story. But you can be a journalist who wants to get a story at any cost and doesn't really care. Or you can approach it in a bit more of an empathetic way and try to get people to work with people. And so I always approach these stories as working with the families. And that approach has worked over the years. And, even though I've bared some of these families' darkest times for all to see, many of them still treat me as friends. And, we're 15 years on from when this happened. And so I feel that I was able to win their confidence. And some of them have been very pleasant and said so publicly that, when the scandal really did erupt and the media circus descended on Stafford, a lot of the families said there were some journalists who treated them badly and they felt used and it wasn't a pleasant experience. And then they always preferred to talk to me because I was a bit more human and understanding. So I think a bit of empathy goes a long way. Fairly confident that's the only reason I've managed to persuade families to talk to me over the years of various different scandals. But I think that human element means that I actually get a better story as well. I think it's better for the reader to hear that. If I can make myself care a little bit about the people I'm interviewing, then that will get across in the article, and that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, and I think there's so many parallels as you're talking there about some of the work that we do around trying to understand people's experiences and how that shaped them. And it is that sense of, I think, as you say, not necessarily putting what you want front and center and giving people time and space, and also the possibility that it won't go anywhere, that actually you're just interested in them.
I mean, the thing as well, Jane, on that, just to talk a bit more about that, is about time as well. So I was very lucky in that even though I worked for a busy daily newspaper, because we had several journalists in the office at any one time covering different things, if there was an interview to be done, I had the time to sit with the families. And I actually always made it sort of like another one of the sort of processes I kind of created for myself at the time was I sort of said to myself, if I'm doing one of these stories, I'm not going to do it over the phone. I'll go and visit the family and I'll do it in person. And that didn't always work and I couldn't always do that. But where I can, I like to go and sit with them. But you get so much more and they get so much more out of it, I think, if you go and see them. Whenever I'm doing interviews now for big stories where I think there's an element of trauma and grief and harm, I try to do it in person. It's less harmful to them as well, which is something I do think about, because I do ask people to relive traumatic experiences. But there is also a skill in how you interview people in those scenarios. So I always try to end an interview like that, where it's something traumatic, by rooting it not in the incident that happened maybe years ago, but talking to the subject of the interview for 10 or 15 minutes about something rooted in today, something that's happening now. So are they going on holiday? Have they bought their Christmas presents? What's their plans for the weekend? And I'll have a sort of pointless conversation about what's going on today, because it will bring them. And I'm not in any way trained at all to do this, but this is just something I've learned over years. But I think it sort of psychologically brings them back to the moment. And so I can leave them in a sort of safer place psychologically. And then I think what happens is those people come away from that interview feeling that was actually not too bad. He's actually quite pleasant to talk to, and he's actually quite nice to deal with. I'm going to recommend my other friend who's got a story talks to him and not anyone else. That's what journalists are out to get. And so that's how I've always approached my job. I'm incredibly grateful for all the stories that have been shared with me and the trust that those families have put in me. And it does weigh on you.
No, I can imagine. Although I am sitting here thinking, you secretly a researcher. All these amazing skills that you're talking about here. I think there's definitely stuff for us to learn. So you talked a little bit about this earlier, but what for you has been the biggest legacy then of the Mid Staffordshire story?
I think we do talk about patient safety in the UK differently now than we did before. And I think it's very easy for people to forget what it was like before. So this whole thing around, nurses could be made redundant to save money before mid-staffs, that was a common thing. I think now if any hospital openly said they were going to make 150 nurses redundant to save money, it would make front page news in newspapers, because it is such an anathema to what we expect the NHS to be doing. And it's just a non-starter now. It's just a no-no. You just don't do it. Maybe people do it quietly, and actually they're doing worse things now by substituting nurses with other staff that maybe raises safety issues, but they're not making them redundant. So I think we changed the conversation about patient safety. There are lots of specific laws that have been changed, regulation that's been changed. Talk about duty of candour is one. There's been debate over staffing ratios. There's lots of things that have happened since mid-staffs, but I think if I was to be trying to sort of group it together in an umbrella kind of statement, I think it did change the conversation. Has it made anything safer? I think probably, unfortunately, I'm on the negative end of that. I think we're in a very bad place at the moment, and I think we risk a lot of the lessons of mid-staffs being forgotten, and I'm extremely worried about that. And there is a part of me, my super cynical part of me, worries that I've wasted the last 15 years trying to expose things and make the NHS safer, because it feels, if not as unsafe as mid-staffs now, possibly even worse, because of the state of the system at the moment. And that does worry me an awful lot.
So I'm interested in the sort of the act of an inquiry. And, this was one of the biggest ones, still remains one of the biggest inquiries, I guess, in patient safety history, if you like, or healthcare safety history. But there's been multiple ones before and since. Do you think healthcare safety is improved by inquiries?
I do think they're of benefit. I think there is a debate about whether public inquiries are worth the money, etc. It's very easy to be cynical and say they're useless and they're not delivering. And Robert Francis had too many recommendations and nothing's been done. The problem is you can't actively know where someone has made a change in their practice because of all of the scandal and the reports and everything else that was discussed at the time. And you can't draw a direct line between it. So there may be a hospital somewhere where a chief executive has done something, partly because of the emphasis that mid-staffs placed on listening to the patients, for example, or recruiting more nurses or something like that. They'll never put it in a document saying, I did this because of the Francis inquiry. So I see these things as they nudge the system in the right direction. And Francis was a pretty hefty nudge. But I think people expect these things to deliver some kind of utopia. We get the report, we get the recommendations. If the government act on them, we'll end up with a utopia. And I think the system's far too complex to ever deliver that. There's no silver bullet to this stuff. But I think the inquiries help nudge in the right direction. There are other reasons to have inquiries, though, as well. From a sort of purely civic point of view, when there's been wrongdoing or failure in a state institution, even if no one goes to the hearings and no one's watching, like with the COVID inquiry right now, it is a valuable thing that we have a system in place to rake over all of that and pull it out, because whilst the general public may be completely disengaged, and maybe even journalists, experts and policy wonks involved in this world will be poring over the details, will be making changes, and that's important. And the other real factor I think inquiries are important is for the families involved. They deserve their truth, and there is a value in that as a society as well, in just providing them those answers. So for lots of reasons, I think inquiries are worth doing. I could equally criticise them, though. They take too long. They can be a bit of a bonanza for lawyers and no one else. I think there are issues with inquiries. Maybe we could streamline the process, but I think we do still need to have these events, because without them, I think the risk is we would just drift. I see myself as being a device to give the NHS a cold, hard slap every now and again. Somebody needs to do it, and the NHS won't do it to itself. So that's why the media do. That's what my job is. I'm a critical friend. My job's to hold the mirror up to the NHS, and an inquiry is a useful way to kind of do that on an official basis. And I think, as I say, I think they nudge things in the right direction, but they're not the end.
No, and it's a fantastic description, I think, of all the sort of multiple reasons why we might need inquiries. But I particularly like your term as sort of civic event. I think that's absolutely what it is and what it does. And it's not just about healthcare improvement. It serves these multiple goals, of which particularly recognition for the families and a voice for the families is really important. Okay, so in 2012, you moved to work with the Health Service Journal. You arrived fresh from breaking this massive healthcare safety story over a period of years. What have been the biggest patient safety issues that you've covered since then?
Oh, there's been so many. I think, so the Health Service Journal is a great institution and does great journalism. And although it's a kind of house magazine for the NHS and NHS managers, in a weird way, we actually kind of give the NHS a hard time, as the HSJ does a lot of investigative journalism, which is very valuable. And I was lucky while I was there to have the time and the resources that's not under the same pressures as a local newspaper without enough staff and resource, etc. So I was able to break some stories there that talk about, one of the things I followed a lot was nurse staffing levels and shortages of nurses at various hospitals and the policies towards that. So one of the great things about the HSJ for me was able to move to this sort of national role at the HSJ and able to take the kind of mid-staff recommendations and lessons from Robert Francis and apply it in different areas and pursue that agenda in different trusts and try to find other things. So I've done all sorts of stories about nurse staffing levels, doctors, failures of regulation, whistleblowing and cover-up cultures, which is a huge issue at mid-staffs. Regulation of managers and the issues around that is something I've written a lot about. And the most obvious one that jumps straight out in my mind is maternity safety. Again, a bit sort of like how I accidentally ended up covering mid-staffs. I sort of accidentally ended up exposing or helping to expose the scandal at Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital Trust, which was probably my next real sort of big scoop. Like, I hate saying scoop like that because it's never my scoop. It's the families who bring the story. I'm just the sort of vehicle for some of those stories. But I started writing about Shrewsbury in 2015 with one family, and it was very much focused around the institutional response of the NHS to that one incident, and the family saying, there's more here, and the NHS England treating that family bad. This was the family of baby Kate Stanton Davis and her parents, Rhiannon and Richard, who went on to really be the forceful parents to expose Shrewsbury. But it started with them, and a little bit like mid-staffs, it broadened out over time. And eventually we ended up with a huge scandal, and one of the worst maternity scandals in NHS history. And it very much followed that same pattern that we talked about with mid-staffs, where more and more families came forward each time. But I bet that in the last few years, maternity safety has been a big issue. And of course, it didn't stop at Shrewsbury. So I went on to expose Nottingham as well, and East Kent Hospital with others writing about it too. And now we know actually what began with Shrewsbury and one family we now know is a national issue around maternity. And again, just like with mid-staffs, this wasn't picked up by the system. It was exposed by families and journalists. And why do we keep having this situation that it's families doing the hard lifting on patient safety? Why isn't the system doing this? And I think that's a big unanswered question for us, that it mustn't be up to families to expose these kinds of things. If we're going to have a system that's working, the system has to be exposing it. The CQC at the moment is doing what it does. Sometimes it is exposing things, but I think all too often it comes in later and it's not able to do the exposing that the families are doing.
So it's probably a question you can't answer. And you said it's the big question, but why do you think it is left to families?
Well, I think we have a culture in the NHS which is, in a word, defensive, and I've still yet to figure out the logic behind it, because as I've said to many people many times, it's if there's a case of a patient being harmed, and the trust has responded properly to that family and apologised and brought them in, worked with them, investigated it, provided a report that reveals all the answers, gives the family the questions. Well, those families, first of all, they won't come to me because they'll have had their answers that they need. Often families come to journalists not because they want to expose trust. They come to us because they want us to get the answers the trust won't give them. So if a trust responds in that way, the families go away, I think. Even if they don't go away, it would be very difficult for me as a journalist to sell that story to my editors if the answer is, well, the trust have investigated it, they've done all the right things, they've apologised to the family, they've paid some compensation. Where's the public interest role for me in that situation? So the fact that I keep finding stories where that isn't the case, the logic, somewhere along the line, something's broken, because trusts seem to want to be defensive to avoid getting the Shaun Lintern treatment. Sort of logic that's failed, really. I also think there's another element to the defensiveness, which is not just about the media, but it's actually more insular. It's the defensiveness around their own organisations and bodies and management. So NHS trusts are fearful of their regional management, and the regional management are fearful of NHS England, and NHS England is fearful of the Department for Health. And that sort of accountability is having a real negative effect, I think, in terms of people speaking honestly to those above them about problems. And people don't want to be the one to say, I've got a problem here, because it brings with it a hailstorm of regulatory processes and top-down scrutiny. And, people see jobs, chief executives who suddenly disappear and are moved, and, all of that. I think all of that creates this culture where it's better to just keep it quiet and don't raise the alarm. Hope the family goes away, deal with it quietly. Oh, maybe we can shift that nurse who keeps raising concerns and putting in datix reports. Maybe we can move her somewhere else, or maybe we can say she's a bully and we'll get her sacked. It'll be better for everyone. And I think there's a lot of self-protection going on in management. I think there's a weakness in NHS management side, which is allowing this to go on. People don't quite know how to deal with some of this tricky stuff. I think you've got to remember as well that in the NHS, my understanding is that we put people in management roles who, for nurses, for example, to become a senior nurse, to earn a good wage as a nurse, you have to move into management, really, which I think is a tragedy. I know there are roles for advanced nurses, but they're few and far between. And so I think we put nurses into these roles and then we don't train them how to do it well. Management is a skill. And I think we've got a lot of managers without the skill sets. That's not a failure of theirs. It's a failure of the system not to provide them with that training. And I think now we're into sort of realms of regulation of managers. And I've always thought that after Mid Staffs, where the chief exec was able to just walk away with huge payoffs and etc. I think we keep seeing that sort of thing happen. I think we are in a situation where we need to be regulating managers, but that regulation has to come with real standards, training, and support and expectations around what their jobs are and how they do it well. I think the NHS is just kind of stuck in the 1980s mindset of management. It's the institution that time forgot, because in the corporate world, this isn't the case. You wouldn't find this sort of thing. It's much more modern and thought about now.
I think it's a great answer, actually. And I was just reflecting on what you were saying about who's scared of who, and it's almost as if it comes around full circle that actually the Department of Health are scared of the public. So actually they're covering up because they're the ones that vote for them. So it kind of goes round and round and round.
Yeah, and I think, there have been cases I'm aware of, and obviously they never make the press, do they? Because for the obvious reason that the right things were done. there are good cases where the right things have been done. They don't make the press. And it's often just because someone has taken the decision to be a leader, and you see some evidence of leadership, and that changes the whole dynamic, and all of a sudden the right things are done. So it seems too simplistic to just say this is a failure of leadership, and that just feels too easy. I know things are more complex than that, but it's also avoidable. That's the thing that, it's such a shame for me. The cover-up side of things is all avoidable. And then when you get to the actual harm, a lot of that is avoidable if we just did the right things and if people just focused on that. But again, the policies around this are about defensiveness. We can't afford that. We don't want to do that. That's problematic. You're now stepping on my turf. Get off my turf. I'm in charge of this. I don't want to do that. And no, I'm not going to use that project from the trust down the road, because they're our competitors, they're our rivals. We're going to develop our own thing. And so we have this sort of thousand flowers blooming sort of situation in the NHS, when actually we should just we know what works and get that in terms of clinical care. We know what works often, and we know where the risks are. And medicines, for example, is a good example of this. That in medicines, we don't change the dose of medicine for patients on a regional or local decision-making basis. We know what works in medicine, so every patient gets the same dose for the same, condition. But yet in patient safety, we seem to just be okay with inventing it all ourselves in each different location. And I don't quite understand that. There's a sort of culture, a cottage industry of sort of doing your own thing. And actually, I think everybody should just be stealing stuff from each other when it works.
That's a whole other podcast, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. Right. Yeah.
And I think, what you're saying there as well, the sort of the quiet successes is really difficult, isn't it? And I'm going to come back to that when I ask you about the role of, more specifically, of journalism. But I think, Eric Holnagel's got this brilliant term, which is that safety is a dynamic non-event. So it's almost as like, particularly with understanding how well things are working, that actually, it's really difficult to distinguish between things you don't know and things that are working really well, because you just, you don't hear about them, and it's this dynamic non-event. So it was really interesting for me to hear you talk about that. So moving to then the role of journalism, what you've talked about, what you think your job is. What do you think the principal role of journalism is in reporting on healthcare?
So in general, I mean, journalism is there to tell the public what is going on in their name. So in a very general sense, healthcare journalism is about reporting what the NHS is doing, why it's doing it, how it affects our readers or the patients. I think the role of journalism is to also expose as well as report. So we report things, but you have to investigate and expose things as well. So there's different sides to journalism. There's nothing wrong in telling the public that there's a policy that's been announced, and that it's quite bog standard, a bit boring, but it needs to be done. That's reporting, and it's perfectly valid. And then there's investigative journalism, which is more about testing some of this stuff and almost being a guardian of your readers, making sure they're not being mistreated, and making sure that the government is doing the right things and the NHS is doing the right things. So I think there's two key arms of reporting and just telling the patients the world as it is. This is our summary of the universe, and it's an early draft of history. And then there's the investigative side, which is the testing out of all of that and making sure that what should be happening is happening and things like that. And those two fit together. And also in healthcare, journalism is about reporting the latest innovations in science and the latest developments in research. That's a really important part of health journalism as well, because we need to be talking about what's coming down the road for patients, what might be treatments for them in the future as well. So there's all really good, interesting articles to be written about the future of medicine, genomics, and personalized medicine, and all of that. What does that mean for the NHS? And the issues articles where you're exploring themes and what that might mean for our readers, as well as reporting and investigating.
So again, there's sort of parallels there, aren't there, into what people should be doing in health services, which is reacting to stuff that is happening, so the reporting of stuff, but also then proactively trying to understand what is happening now and what might happen in the future. So those are these are similar processes, I guess, for, how people might try to understand safety in organisation. So a bigger question, I suppose, which is, do you think journalism simply reflects the safety of healthcare, or does it shape the safety of healthcare?
I'm very lucky at the Sunday Times that almost uniquely for us, because by the nature of what we are, I do almost always investigative journalism. That's kind of what I'm always trying to do. We don't do much reporting of just the world as it is. That tends to be something more for the daily newspapers and our daily sister paper, the Times. So I'd like to say I'm shaping things all the time, because that's what you want investigative journalism to be. That's investigative journalism, in a way, can be biased in a sense, not in the way it's reported, but in biased in the sense of we are supposed to objectively be able to say that was wrong and this is what should be being done. And that just we've clearly reached a position there. So there's a bias. But with investigative journalism, that's kind of allowed because you've got the facts and the evidence to back it up. So you're being a bit more activist as a media outlet. And so I think that clearly must shape the system. And we see that all the time in governments reacting with inquiries and calling things and responding to what the media is writing about. But I don't think we always do that. Maybe we should be shaping things more. Maybe that's where we're going wrong. Maybe we're doing too much of the, Rishi Sunak says this, Wes Streeting says that. Maybe we should do less of that kind of reporting and more of the trying to shape things. But then, then we're into the realm of, who guards the Guardians? If we're the Guardians and we go down that road, who's going to stop us going rogue? I understand here and defend journalism. There is some terrible journalism that goes on in healthcare, and there is some terrible journalists, and they behave in terrible ways. Like all professions, we're not even a profession; we're a trade. So, but like all jobs, there are good and bad eggs, and I think we get it wrong a lot of the time as well.
So you've mentioned maternity, and I think this is a big issue, isn't it, currently in healthcare services? And anecdotally, I hear from people who are midwives or say who know midwives and who say it's really hard for me at the moment to tell people I'm a midwife, or do you feel that as a journalist, in the sense of you're both breaking these really important stories, but you're also then almost layering on more scandal after scandal, and what's that? What do you worry about what that does to the staff or the morale? Or
I mean, that's a big question, and I've been asked that question before, and people will say to me, oh, you're only interested in bad news, you make it worse, etc., etc. What I would say is, first of all, you have to remember where a story starts. The story doesn't start with me; it starts with the patient who was harmed.
Yes,
so that's the first start point. So often I will get midwives or nurses who will criticize me for writing a story, and I sort of have to gently point out to them, well, I'm writing it because this baby died, so let's remember where it starts from. And then even I can see why staff get frustrated when they see just a cascade of negative stories about maternity services. And, I saw it with Mid Staffs in a very localized way. I was criticized for my reporting in Mid Staffs by some people. I got phone calls in the office late at night from people who didn't want to give their name about what they thought about me and my reporting. It's a classic sort of shoot the messenger scenario, and people will forget what my role is, what I'm trying to do. And they also need to see this in a bigger picture. So if you look at Stafford Hospital now today, it's been renamed, but as a result of the scandal, Stafford Hospital got hundreds of millions of pounds of extra investment. It got more staff, and it isn't a scandal hospital anymore. It's improved. And so there's a sort of U-bend shape in these stories. I come in just at the end and give the push off the edge of the cliff, and the staff will think I'm terrible and evil because I've destroyed their hospital or whatever. But the story doesn't end there. It carries on. And often you see there does come a time when things improve and get better, and I'll move on and go somewhere else. And it's a hard journey. And I totally understand that for staff. And I've spoken to lots of staff who really feel it. The problem is it's not those staff that I want to upset. I need to upset the ones who aren't bothered about the stories, who did the harm in the first place. And it's them that we need to reach. But I think some of those people who feel frustrated at journalists just need to remember the journey that we're on and why we're doing what we're doing. People say about, oh, you're just interested in bad news because that sells newspapers. Well, it doesn't really anymore. That's not really how it works. But the Sunday Times, we're big. We still sell a lot of printed newspapers, but actually most of our stuff now is online subscriptions. One of the problems we have, though, is getting good stories out of the NHS. And I've said this before in a few places, and I've said it to many in the NHS. I don't think the NHS knows what a good story is. Some of the stuff that people try and pitch to me as a good story is woeful and will never make it into a newspaper. And then when I do find good stories, I have to work really hard to persuade the NHS to let me do them. So I know there is lots of good work going on in the NHS every day. And some of it is exceptionally good, out of extraordinarily good news and well worth the coverage. But getting it to me seems to be a real problem. And I think it's quite interesting that lots of NHS staff are filling my inbox and Twitter DMs every day with stories, negative stories. They're just as bad as the public for exposing things, but they very rarely have good stories to tell me. And so I think there's a cultural issue there. We don't celebrate the good stuff in the NHS. And I can guarantee you, if I came to the Sunday Times with a really good story, my editors would bite my hand off because the readers do enjoy reading them. I don't know if this is rambling too much, but there's an example of exactly this. We had earlier this year, there was a story that I picked up from just having a coffee with a consultant who told me about this piece of work that a colleague of his was involved in. And it turned out to be the Paediatric Fertility Preservation Service, which I'd never heard of. But effectively, this involves taking tissue from children who've got cancer, storing it in a very specialised way, and enabling them to have children later in life. And I found out that we'd actually had our first birth in England using this service. And it was a great story. And the family, if we can track the family down, this would be a great story. And I had no end of trouble persuading the NHS to actually help me to do this. In the end, I had to almost deploy the kind of investigative methods that I have to use for a big scandal. So I had to track down a doctor and through using different methods. And I could only interview her through her role in the local university, not the trust, because the trust didn't want to cooperate. And the family, I was able to track the family down. And the moment we got in touch with them, the family were like, oh, yes, we'd love to do this story. And so we ended up with a story of this photograph of this beautiful young little toddler, beaming, smiling mom and dad who were so happy that, they got this baby that they thought they would never have. And it was a great story. And not only that, it had a real positive outcome as well, because the NHS has now decided to fund that service on the NHS tariff. It wasn't before, which made it a great story because all the doctors were working they were doing it on a sort of voluntary basis. So it was even better. It was an extraordinary level of commitment by the staff involved to do this amazing thing for these children and this lady who had the baby. But I couldn't get the NHS Trust to work with me on it. And I've still not really ever understood why. But that's just a little example. But those kinds of stories would fly into the Sunday Times. So it's not always the journalist's fault.
No, it's a good challenge to all of us then, isn't it? But, we need to...
say something else on that, Jane, as well.
Of course.
Because you've tickled my sort of issue with now, because this is something journalists are often criticised for about negative coverage. Just say to anyone listening, if you go onto Google News and you just type in something like NHS praised or nurses praised or hospital praised or some version of that, you will find on Google dozens and dozens and dozens of stories that have been written by local newspapers and journalists in the national press as well, covering positive news. We do cover positive news. It is reported. And I think I did see a really interesting study once about this, and I don't know if it's true actually, so I'm sure someone can tell us, but the human brain actually locks onto and remembers more negative information, more the threats, effectively. It's an evolutionary thing. And I do wonder if we are not necessarily remembering and monitoring the positive news that is in the press about the NHS, because it's there on the internet. There's lots of examples. And so, I always like to push back on this thing about journalists being negative. But, a good story is a classic man bites dog story. And the other thing we need to talk about is the fact that often a lot of the stuff I write, I'm writing them because they are so bad and so rare that it makes it a news story. And I think there's something about media literacy in this country that people seem to think if I write a maternity story about Shrewsbury, that must mean I think all maternity services are dangerous and deadly. And actually, that's completely wrong. I wrote a story about Shrewsbury because Shrewsbury was a terrible example and a terrible case study, and it's not the norm. And that's why it's news. Although maybe maternity is a bad example because it seems to be becoming a bit of a systemic problem nationally. But I just sometimes think people need to read things in the right context and remember that it's news because it's unusually bad makes it a news story. Because we know there's a lot of good out there. And, I think a few years ago I was at the Patient Safety Congress and I said to the audience that, the NHS sees 1 million people every 17 hours. And people always say to me, oh, we get it right 99.9% of the time. And so I made everyone in the hall at the Patient Safety Congress stand up. And I said to them all, look around you. Look at how many people are in this room now. It's roughly 1,000 people, which is 0.01% of 1 million. And it's 1,000 people. That's how many people. If you're telling me the NHS gets it right 99.9% of the time, well, this is how many people it gets it wrong for every 17 hours. Look at the size of this room and how many people there are. Now tell me that we shouldn't be thinking about that and we shouldn't be talking about that because that could be your mum, your sister, your brother. The NHS sees so many people, the volume is so huge, but we're talking about real people. And just that small, tiny sliver of 1% is a lot of people. And we should be thinking about that.
I think that tension between people's experiences and being harmed and the notion that, safety is a system property, those two things it is hard to reconcile, I think. And I don't think traditionally we've necessarily been able to reconcile those two positions. And it's often that health services are sort of in that system safety, well, 99%, goes right. And then, but actually when you're sitting with a harmed patient or family, those don't matter. It doesn't matter to them and nor should it. And I think that's our ongoing challenge, I think, in patient safety. So Ellen Goodman, the American Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, is quoted as saying, in journalism, always been a tension between getting it first and getting it right. Do you ever worry that you've got a story wrong?
I've definitely got stories wrong. I've definitely made errors in the stories. So I'm very proud to sit here after 21 years as a journalist to say I have never been referred to the Press Complaints Commission. I'll take that as something right.
More than 99% of the time you're going to get.
Exactly, yeah. I have never been sued for any articles, which, if you consider the kind of articles I write about certain doctors and sometimes as well as organisations, you might think that might have happened, but it never has. But that doesn't mean I haven't made errors. There've been minor things that don't alter the outcome of the story, but the worry about doing that is immense. And I think people don't understand what the job of a journalist is. And, you get a lot of people online who will criticize you as, oh, you just bash these things out, you don't think about it, etc. And I can guarantee you that me and my colleagues do. And, we all talk to each other about our sleepless nights when one of our stories is about to go out. We're very lucky at the Sunday Times. We've got a team of lawyers here. We've got a team of sub-editors and news editors who check things and we discuss things and we go over everything, which hopefully irons out any mistakes. But that worry is always there. And especially when you are working for an institution like the Sunday Times, if you get it wrong, you're not just damaging yourself, you're damaging a world famous newspaper brand. And so, that weighs heavy, that responsibility. I did once kill someone who wasn't actually dead. This was a local councillor. This is many years ago. I was a young green reporter. So I think this is probably one of the worst mistakes of journalism I've made. And it was a case of Chinese whispers. He'd been taken seriously ill And I spoke to multiple sources, fellow counsellors and people involved who all said the same thing. When I hadn't sort of twigged at that point, because I was a young journalist, that, okay, yes, I've ticked the box for multiple sources giving me the information. But what I hadn't realised is they were probably all getting it from each other. And actually, what I was trapped in a Chinese whisper, and what I needed was some sort of another source that was different to those. It all ended okay though, because he took it very well. Gave me a call, and he said the rumours of his demise were greatly exaggerated, and but he said he wasn't complaining because his wife was enjoying all the flowers that she had been sent. So it worked out okay in the end.
The upside to being declared deceased.
Yes, yeah.
And it's so much of what you said to me today, that I think there are parallels with how we need to manage safety. Just in what you've described there, like triangulating data, constant inquiry, not assuming one source is going to give you what you need. Do you feel like there are parallels in what you do with what people are trying to do in healthcare organisations to manage safety?
I think so, yeah. I think you've just described it quite well. And I think about sort of serious incident investigation reports. And, whilst the structure is often completely dreadful, and I wouldn't in any way ever seek to emulate that, some of the processes that they've gone through to deliver that report is the same as I have. And I think, as journalists, we learn the skills of checking information, verifying information. And people think my job is really glamorous. It isn't. Spotlight was a great movie because it showed really that a lot of this is just going through data and paperwork. It's really dull and boring. You get a little bit of glamour every now and again, but most of it's drudgery. But you do that to triangulate and check things. And the process of an investigative journalist, I think, is very similar to investigating a safety incident in an institution, I would imagine.
Is there somebody in your career that you wish you had interviewed? Who would it be and why?
From a healthcare perspective or?
Any perspective.
So a professional sort of crush of mine is Harold Evans, the former editor of the Sunday Times.
Okay.
So he is a legendary editor amongst journalists and broke some of the biggest stories in the Sunday Times history, but also really in journalism history. So thalidomide is the obvious one.
Right.
He obviously didn't do it himself. He was the editor. There was a team, the Sunday Times, but it was his leadership that really broke the story. And there was a moment when the Sunday Times was effectively barred from reporting thalidomide because of contempt of court laws at the time in the 1970s. And Evans, being the kind of editor that he was, decided they were going to publish anyway and effectively broke the law. And the Sunday Times ended up in courts, ended up in the law lords as was then, and ended up going all the way to Strasbourg and to challenge the government's ruling on this. And ultimately, as a result of the Sunday Times, they got the law in Britain changed so that people like me can now write about things whilst there's a court trial going on. They changed the contempt of court laws, and it didn't just work for me, it worked for everybody, all of us. He was a real campaigning editor, a real visionary, I think. And I often wish I was sort of born 20 years earlier, or 30 years earlier. I might have had a chance of working under him at the Sunday Times. But I got to meet him once, very briefly, but not to interview him. But he was giving a talk, and I had this is how sad I am, I had my first edition copy of the book that was written by the Sunday Times team. So the Sunday Times team published a book, the Suffer the Children, it was called, I think, and it was all about their investigation of thalidomide. I would have loved to sit down with him for a pint and discuss journalism and healthcare. But the thalidomide investigation is special to me because for those who read the Sunday Times, they might know, but I hadn't long been at the Sunday Times before I sort of came across my own thalidomide in the form of sodium valproate, which is an epilepsy drug, which for years has been given to women with epilepsy that's damaged their babies, even though there was known risks to it, and that was kept from the women. And the Sunday Times, I'm very proud of this, that the Sunday Times have taken this up as an issue and are actively campaigning for financial redress for those families. But it was one of my big first investigations for the Sunday Times, and we actually called it Scandal Worse Than Thalidomide, which, given the legacy and history of thalidomide, the Sunday Times, it was a it was one of those stories that I feel almost, I can't quite believe I was allowed to write that story and have my byline on it, because it was, it meant a lot to those families, but also it was, for me, it was kind of, it meant something to me to be following in Harry Evans's footsteps. So I'd love to know what he thinks of our campaign, and I'd like to ask him for some advice as to how we can push the campaign forward, because we need the government to act on this, and they haven't agreed to yet. So we'll wait and see what happens. So maybe his advice would be quite useful.
That's a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing that. So finally, people might not know, but you interviewed me once for a story. I'm interested how I have compared as an interviewer, and will I make it in journalism?
You've been very good at leading me down certain paths, which is, which is, I mean, the leading question is exactly what you should do in journalism. In most professions, then you're supposed to avoid a leading question, but in journalism, it's all about leading questions. So, no, yes, it's interesting to be interviewed by you. You're getting your own back, Jane.
I'm getting mine back, and I promise not to use a lurid headline to advertise this podcast.
Well, let's see, because the temptation is always there.
It's always there. I'm taking quote.
I'm interested in when I was talking about how I interview people, were you sitting there thinking, oh, yes, he used those tricks on me?
A bit.
Yeah, actually, I'd forgotten about that when I was talking about it earlier. Now you've made me think.
No, not at all. You made me feel very comfortable in it. In fact, I remember saying to you, you've done incredibly well. I thought as a researcher that you'd done incredibly well to get that from me. So
I'm very lucky to do the job I do, and I always feel very privileged that people trust me with their stories, and I do take that responsibility very seriously, and I hope that comes across in the work that I do.
Shaun, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for giving me so much of your time.
My pleasure. It's been a genuine pleasure. And if anyone listening has a good story they want to give to the Sunday Times, they know where to find me.
I just have to point that out. Not sponsored by the Sunday Times. It is, in fact, sponsored by the Yorkshire and Humber Patient Safety Research Collaboration. Thank you, Shaun.
No worries. My pleasure. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks for listening. We hope you have enjoyed this episode, and do check out the others in this 6-part series. The series is funded by the National Institute for Health and Care Research and brought to you by the Patient Safety Research Collaboration in Yorkshire and Humber. The views expressed by the guests are their own and do not represent those of the NIHR or the Department of Health and Social Care.